So we're going to move on today to what's called in the yoga tradition the Pratyahara, or the fifth limb of yoga, sometimes called the forgotten limb. There's in popular yoga literature, there isn't much written about it. It's not talked about much. Most people do not have a Pratyahara practice, and this is why it's considered the forgotten limb. And I think as we talk about it, you might see why it might we may want to leave it out of our practice, as it has a feeling of kind of taking away the pleasure of life. And we tend to avoid things that want to take away our good times. So in the tradition, the fifth limb, Pratyahara, is kind of seen as this gateway or pivot point as we go from practice in the outer world to practice in our inner world. Kind of working with the gross physical, the body, our relationships in the world, to really working with our relationship with ourself. And it's this transition point that happens here. For those who were here for the last talk on pranayama, we talked about pranayama as the beginning of that bridge of breath as a kind of a gross process in our physical body that we can be aware of, and the breathing from the outside, bringing the air inside, from the inside back outside, and we can follow that. And in pranayama, the visualization or the symbol is like a doorway, a swinging door in space. Right? So if you can imagine that, outer space, there's a door. And we think of a door as you going from someplace to someplace. But of course, if you're in outer space and you go through a door, what has really changed, right? But yet there's still this idea of a door, right? So it implies something. And so we think of pranayama in that way, right? As this image of this door and the sense of we're going from in to out, but the idea being there is no difference between in and out, right? It's all the same space. So we take that idea and the physical breath as kind of the gross vehicle, and even behind the physical breath is the idea of prana, right? And that would take us into the subtle level of the prana, the energy of breath, and we can ride that energy of breath to the in and the out and the moving. Right? So an image maybe for the Pratyahara is, I think of like a colander. If you've ever eaten a colander, a sieve, right? Can you imagine trying to bail water with a colander? Right? Wouldn't get very far. As much as you get in, it falls out. Right? And so there's this image for Pratyahara. And the idea is that our senses, right? So the five gross senses, hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, touch, right? The five gross senses. And then the mind is considered a sense as well, so we could call that the sixth sense. There's another sense called interoception. So that is the feeling of the interior of our body, right? So if you can sense your knee, or if you notice your stomach feels tight, that's interoception, right? So that information is streaming up into the brain. So that's also a sense, so we call that a seventh sense, right? So that we have at least those seven senses. And then there's equivalents of those on the inside called the subtle senses, right? So we all have an inside voice, and we listen to our inside voice, right? But you don't hear it through your physical ear. You hear it through the inner sense, the subtle sense of hearing. Right? Or you've maybe heard somebody metaphorically say to taste your experience, or to feel the texture of a mental image. Right? So these are this idea that we have a subtle version of the gross senses, kind of in the interior. Right? So we can imagine that we have the seven gross senses and then seven subtle senses. And In the traditions, the senses are seen as like the holes in a colander, right? If attention is the water that you're trying to bail, if that's attention, the senses are the holes, and our attention is always going out through the holes, right? It's going out into, in terms of the gross senses, out into the world, and in terms of the interior, the subtle senses, it's going out into our experience, but our internal experience, but it's still going kind of towards experience, right? So this idea of inside, outside changes. It gets more subtle. It's not just the skin, some idea of that as a representation of in and out, but getting closer into what do we mean by I, the I am, and then the not I, and that the skin doesn't represent that boundary. So the practice of Pratyahara invites us to explore this, and then ultimately gives us practices to a number of things. Come to the realization that what the traditions tell us are true, come to see that this is true, and then begin to have some control over attention so that attention isn't always leaking out of the colander, right? So that it can be held, right, in a bowl. And the why of that, why do that, is the sixth limb of yoga is meditation, right? It's a beginning meditation, dhyana, right? It's the concentration. So in that, we want to be able to take our attention, place it on an object of choice, and maintain it there. And we want to be able to fill that bowl with attention. But if the bowl is full of holes, you can imagine what happens, right? And anybody who meditates know that this is what happens when you sit to meditate, is your attention is constantly being, leaking away out into your experience, whether that's in the gross world, the sound of a car going by, and all of a sudden attention goes and attends to that, the sound of somebody walking by, somebody behind you talking, and all of a sudden you're having some relationship with their conversation, either listening to it and being fascinated by it, or annoyed by it, right? Imagining what you would say. You would say something to make them stop talking and interrupting you, right? Either way, attention is no longer where you want it to be and is on something else. Right? So each limb of yoga is growing towards the final, the eighth limb, samadhi. Right? The absorption or union of attention with the object of interest. That's the goal. Each step takes us closer to that and gives us practices and skills to accomplish that. And Pratyahara is no different. It gives us a set of skills in which to get to the sixth limb. So that's its position in the scheme of things, right? It's this transition point from being involved in the outer world and in doing, and slowly becoming and really starting to turn and investigate the sense of the I am. Right? And kind of the third level of practice in the Pratyahara is to be able to follow the senses back to the one who receives that information, the one who makes something out of it. So to be able to follow the current of your vision, right? So your visual sense, back to the one who is seeing whatever it is you're seeing. The same thing with your hearing, to be able to follow hearing back to the physical ear, through the auditory nerve, to the brain, to the representation from the sound, to the one who takes that representation and makes something out of it, and ultimately has the sense of knowing something, right? To do that. In a sense, that's the kind of the final practice. But I say that one first so you can get a general sense of that's the goal. Right? The goal is to be able to follow the current of the senses from the gross to the subtle to the one who is the realizer of that information, that being the central self. in the practice to find the way into that central self. And the senses are a pathway. Right? So in that sense, they're good. We can utilize them, right? And that's part of the strategy, and I think the brilliance of this particular practice is we could see the senses as a problem and try and fight against them as something we need to get rid of, right? To see them as, again, the problem. Because I'm constantly being distracted, I can't concentrate my awareness and to become kind of polarized with it and get into a fight, right? This is often the case. I hear students say it all the time. They're trying to stop their mind, stop their thinking, trying to control it, right? And what yoga is saying is to cooperate with it. Right? Use the mechanism for what it does, and it will take you to where you want to go. Kind of the going with as opposed to the becoming polar and fighting against. Yeah. So one of the ways we do this is just to begin to find out, is anything that I'm saying true? Right? Like actually in your own experience. Right? Not whether or not what I'm saying is true or right, or what the traditions are saying is true or right in the sense of you would just believe it. But it only matters is when you see it in your own experience and have the aha, like, oh, there I am doing it. And what is that like? Right? And so an example might be like one of my teachers would say, so to sit in darshan, right, is to sit with the teacher and be in the presence of the transmission, right? So that darshan. And that could be a teacher in the sense of a living person, or it could be, if you're Christian, it could be sitting in the church in front of the altar and maybe a cross, and those symbols are the representation, and that is the evocation of kind of the divine spirit for you, right? And that amplifies it. And so you put yourself in the presence of that current to amplify that force. So my teacher would say, you could be sitting in the presence of God, and somebody could walk by with a tray of chocolate chip cookies, and your attention would go, cookie, right? I mean, this happens. Or, if chocolate chip cookies aren't your thing, they happen to be my thing, but there are other things that you can imagine, right? Just an attractive person walks by. Maybe it's the usher, and all of a sudden your attention is, right? So you're sitting there in the church in front of all of the symbols and the power and the potency of the divine, and that's what you came for, and now you're more interested in that, right? The shiny object. So this happens to us over and over and over and over again, right? And so part of the practice of Pratyahara is first to come to see that happens, right? Letting go of any judgment or anything about it, but just beginning to notice how does that happen? How do you kind of move away from yourself? And then to begin to notice, how does that feel? Right? How does that feel when your attention just runs off like that, kind of away from whatever you were intending to be attending to, and it just runs off, and in the moment you can think of it as often, behind that is desire, right? It's the impulse of desire, of we see something that we want, or we see something that we think we want, and our attention goes there. And so there's the desire, and then attention goes to it. What we want to begin to find out is, what does that feel like? What does that impulse of desire itself feel like? And then what is the feeling of when attention kind of goes away from us into the desired object? How does that feel? And you might find that, at the root of desire, there can be a sense of deficiency. Like, I don't feel like I have enough, or I don't feel like I am enough. There's a lack, there's a hole, there's a void. Right? And to get in touch with that, it can be painful, disturbing, distressing, displeasing. And then the feeling of just attention kind of going off, just quickly, just kind of run off to, here's what I'm attending to, attention goes over here. To feel that, it can have a feeling of betrayal, abandonment, right? Kind of out of control, impulsive. It can also feel good, right? I mean, so I'm saying kind of the downside to it, but kind of our desires can seeking or following our desire can have a good feeling to it, right? We can feel like I'm on the hunt, right? And that can feel, it can be a pleasure to that. You know? I'm gonna get what I want. Right? I'm in the pursuit of what I want. That can feel good, pleasurable. The getting of what I want, that can feel pleasurable. It's usually why we do it, right? We think the chocolate chip cookie is gonna make us happy. We get it, we eat it for a moment, it's good, and then afterwards it's like, wasn't as good as I had imagined. Or, you know, you realize like in that I missed something, and we feel bad about whatever we missed, right? So this is the side that we want to kind of begin to open up to and get into, to see, you know, to find out what is this actually like in us. So rather than it being some esoteric exercise that we just do or don't do because the book says that we should do this and we do it, or the book says we do it and we avoid it, either way. But is to look into it and to see it actually functioning live in ourselves. I think what you'll find out is that when you start to notice what your senses are up to, that for the most part, you're not going to be that pleased about it. And that becomes the motivation to practice, is when you start to directly notice your displeasure, what you're not getting, what you're giving up, what you're losing, then you just naturally will want to undertake the practice. And it won't be kind of an outside imposition, feeling like somehow you're taking on a discipline and I don't want to, you're the child, right, in relationship to some authority figure that's making you have to do your homework, right? But to actually want to. Completely different relationship to the practice. So when we talked about in the yamas and the niyamas, so the first and second limbs of yoga, we talked about a small version of the Pratyahara, right? Of the disciplining the senses. So this time around, it's the same thing, only the practice is fuller and deeper, and it is calling for more of a commitment. The first one is to begin to just prepare one for practice. Just kind of clean up your life a little bit. This one is again, same practice, only it's asking for more of your attention. Instead of being one of 10 things, the yamas and niyamas, here it is given a whole limb, right? And it's a stage of development. So it can start simply by looking at your life and what are you taking in through your senses. So what are you reading? What are you watching? TV, movies, right? What kind of conversations are you getting involved in, right? So you start to look at those and just kind of objectively, right, ask yourself, is this content nourishing me? Right? And if the answer is yes, good, okay, that's in. If the answer is no, then it's pretty obvious, right? So the beginning would be that. Just kind of look at what you're watching and or reading, taking in, right, through the visual senses, through the auditory senses, and make some just general decisions like that. Start cutting out the things that aren't serving you. Right? So that's easy enough, right, in theory. Right? And then the subjective side, right, is then the things that you've decided that these nourish me, these help me, these support me in my path of self-realization. Then to do the same thing with those, to really be present to it, present to the desire to go towards it, the impulse to engage in it, how it is to be in it, and then how you feel afterwards, right? And begin to really become aware of this idea that you've decided this activity, reading this kind of material nourishes me. Right? And then begin to look into it and really see. Right? And you might find out that perhaps you like to read novels, and there's nothing particularly wrong with the content of the novel, right? But you might find out that in reading the novel that you're doing it as a form of distraction, kind of narcotizing, right? To escape the world. Right? So you might look at that and say, well, you know what? Actually, it seemed like it was nourishing me because it takes me away from the displeasure of my normal moment-to-moment awareness, where I'm perhaps in touch with painful feelings, and I don't want to be, so I read my book. But in looking into it, you might come to find out that actually, probably, maybe, that's not really serving you. So you make the choice to let that go. And it's like that. Just simple like that, looking at through the gross senses what you're taking in, kinds of, again, conversations you're having with friends, right? So one of the classics is engaging in gossip. Right? Generally, we find there's not much about gossip that truly nourishes your soul. Right? It can kind of tantalize the personality and be pleasurable in that sense, but it probably doesn't really nourish you. Right? So again, the kind of thing you can look at, see, choose not to engage in. So those ones are fairly easy. And I say that easy in that they're easier to identify and make change. It's not always easy to stick to it, right? There's a number of TV shows that I have frequently vowed not to watch anymore, and then I find myself watching them because they're just so good. And they're good in the sense of they pleasurably distract me from the rest of my life. And they engage me in that way, and they invoke a lot of feeling, the dramatic. And that becomes, that's what flips the pleasure switch for me, right? So, easy for me to recognize that I shouldn't be doing that. More challenging to stop the behavior, but it starts with the recognition. Right? So from there we go, kind of more subtle. We can go interior and get into some of these same things on the interior, conversations we're having with ourselves. Right? So we've often heard about kind of the negative self-talk, right? So that's certainly a good one to notice and again, we don't necessarily want to get polar with it, right? But we just choose to not put our awareness in it. We don't try and stop it, stuff it down, judge it, make it wrong, criticize ourselves for it. You notice it, and you just choose to put your attention someplace else. Right? But also, you may find what are the mental images that are in your mind. What's going on in kind of your internal visual center. And same thing, you see what's there and you make a decision around it. Is this nourishing? Is it not? If not, then same thing. When it arises, you don't interact with it, right? You just move your attention to that which you have decided is better for you. Right? So same thing on the internal senses. So these are the first two stages of practice of Pratyahara. First, external, in the gross world, what are we doing with our senses? Starting to discipline ourselves around that. Then internally, right, that's stage two, working around what are we doing internally. And then the sense is, as one does that, one is growing the ability to kind of discipline oneself around indulging in the senses, so that muscle is growing. This idea of discerning awareness is growing, what's good for me, what's not, what serves me and what doesn't. And having the ability to withdraw attention, right? Being able to focus on that quality, that faculty, and withdraw attention. You start to grow the capacity to do that by practicing it. So practicing those two leads us to that third one that I had mentioned first, right? Which is the ability, now that you have followed your awareness going out through your senses and how that happened, you become a student of that. Now we reverse that process. and follow the path back. And let that take us all the way into the I. The I who is the receiver of that. But in having done level 1 and level 2, you'll have a pretty good idea of where that one is. Right? And so the path that if we just tried to start at 3 would seem kind of nebulous and mysterious and kind of groping in the dark. And because it's all those things, doesn't mean don't try. It's a fine thing to try. Just like in a traditional setting, they would say, a traditional teacher would say to a new student, like, no meditation for you, right? You don't get to meditate till years later. You're going to do all of these practices, right? You're going to do the first 5 limbs of yoga before you get to meditate, right? But here in the West, we kind of just think, well, I'll just start with meditation, right? And we grope and grapple our way through the dark of that and try and cobble together something that seems like a practice. That's fine. It's a fine thing to do. So same thing. You can practice that 3rd level of Pratyahara following your senses at any point in time. It's a fine thing to do. But my suggestion is start with number 1. Practice number 1 regularly. Practice number 2 all the time, but you'll find it's easier to really practice number 2 when you've been practicing 1 consistently. You'll build the skills and the capacity to be more effective. And same thing, when you've done 1 and 2, 3 will become more effective. But you can practice all of them all the time. I want to do a couple of exercises where you guys can explore this on your own. Right? So the first one is going to be a little different than what we've done for exercises before. Usually we do repeating questions. This one is going to be a little bit more like an inquiry in the moment. And so we say a monologue, right? In that it's one person in the group doing the exercise at a time. So one person will have the 2 minutes to do that, and then the other person will have the 2 minutes to do the exercise. It's not interactive like the repeating question. Okay? And what you're going to do is to just simply sit, and not in any particular way. You're not trying to meditate or do anything. You're just going to sit as yourself, the same way you've been sitting as yourself here, and just kind of notice. Notice where your awareness goes. Where do your senses go? Do they get drawn out into the building, noticing the sun in the stained glass, noticing some feature of the room, the temperature, the softness or discomfort of your chair, something about your partner, right? Might notice color of clothing or any number of things. Right? So you're just going to notice that, and then just say it out loud. Just simply notice my awareness goes to the symbols on the back of the room. And notice my awareness goes to the congestion, sinus congestion. Now my awareness goes to the space behind me. Now in kind of revealing some of my interior, I notice it goes to feeling kind of nervous, a little nervous, anxious. Like that, right? So just noticing where in the moment does your attention actually go, right? Now, so this can be tricky to do, because there'll be part of you who's wanting to get it right or make something happen, and so we'll be in there like directing, attend to this, now attend to that, now you should think about that, So just notice, right? If that happens, okay. And just see how it is to not attend to that or notice. Like I notice, there's one in me who's really trying to direct this exercise. Okay? And like that, just nice and simple and light, and in a way no one cares. right? And then, so we're going to do this in dyad, so you're going to have a partner sitting across, and the partner is just being present. You're just there, sensing your own body, primarily being present to yourself, right? You're not engaging your partner. We want to keep social cues to a minimum, right? So you're not smiling and nodding and engaging them, because we don't want to draw out their social persona, right? That they all of a sudden feel that they have to entertain you or whatever that is, right? So you're just being present to yourself. Your presence is including them because they're there, but your attention is really on your interior and being present, such that your presence helps them be present. Right? That's really what we want to do as the partner in this exercise, is help create that field of presence that lets them do their exploration and get in touch with this material. Right? So it'll be 2 minutes and then 2 minutes, and then after that, I'll give you your next exercise. Okay? Any questions about that before we go off and get started? No? Okay. So grab a partner, find a space, turn 2 chairs facing each other, and I will do the time, so I'll let you know when to get started. Are you? Yeah. If you want to turn face first, that'd be great. Yep. Okay, so decide who's going to go first. And away you go. Okay. Other person. Away you go. okay. You can stay where you are, and I'm just going to say a few things to set up for the next practice, and then go right into it. So I want you to kind of hold the idea that the traditions speak to in terms of the enlightened disposition. Right? So the idea of the self resting in the self as the self. Right? So this idea of being just perfectly complete as you are, no restlessness, no impulse to anything, just simply being as you are. And so the word that is often used is the effulgence of the self. Right? So rather than our typical kind of personality or ego self having this kind of core of deficiency and need and want and trying to draw into itself, right? That the self, our true self, is effulgent. It's overflowing. It is flowing outwards. Right? It has so much of itself that is continually outflowing. Right? So that idea, even ideal, right? So that ideal of the self resting in the self as the self, undisturbed, right? At peace. Right? So holding that as a potential and as a possibility, and also the truth of you, right? The always already truth of you. Then you're going to ask the question of, tell me a way you leave yourself. That's going to be the question that you ask your partner. Tell me a way you leave yourself. Right? And then that's going to be, if you imagining that you're there, perfectly content. That's the truth of you. Then just recalling moments in your life when that you've lost the sense of that and you've reached out into the world to get something. When desire has raised up and you go out, whether it's just momentary, like a fantasy, or actual, get up off the couch and go to the fridge and get something to stick in your mouth, right? You just ate half an hour ago, but all of a sudden you need to stick something in there, right? That. So this idea of that the senses flowing out to grasp an object, right? That's the act of restlessness and desire and need, and that's leaving the self. So you're just going to answer the question, tell me a way you leave yourself. Okay? So you can go back to the person who went first, and you'll just ask that question. Your partner will give you a relatively short answer, right? And you say thank you and ask the question again. And I don't know is a perfectly good answer, but go with whatever arises, right? The goal here is to be with yourself in the moment as you're arising. And whatever comes out, even if it has nothing to do with the question, it's what's arising. The question is just an evocation, right? But it isn't to be answered by the mind. So, away you go. Okay, so now other person, ask the question, wait for the answer, say thank you, ask the question again, wait for the answer, say thank you, ask the question again. Okay? Away you go. All right. Come on back in. All right. So what did you find out? All right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. So you have a long list of this is true.
I'm aware of what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
that I'm doing it, and why I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's, like you were saying earlier, I can stop it, but I'm aware of it at least.
Right, right. Good. Good. Right. Yeah, you had a and, okay. And did you see that as a way in which you leave yourself, or? Good to see. Yeah. Yes, yes, and well put too. Lots of that kind of image and storytelling in the traditions. You know, how we pack our bag and leave our home, and go off on these long journeys. Yeah. So very good.
What you were saying about music,
Mm-hmm.
it's something that really, if you're really in the present moment with it, are you leaving yourself, or are you finding yourself?
I think that's a great question, and the only way that can be answered is, in the immediacy of the knowing of of is the music part of the effulgence? You know, is it coming from the overflowing of the self? Or is it coming from the place of, you know, the desire, the one who's seeking to get back, have some contact? You know, which side is it coming from? And you know, that both are perfectly possible. The trick is coming to know which it is in the moment. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good point in that none of this is about judging any activity as right or wrong, valuable, invaluable. It's the discerning awareness. It's coming to see the truth of it, right? So that you can, in the traditions, they say one of the barriers to self-realization is avidya, right? Or translated is ignorance. So that can be kind of a pejorative word, and we don't like to use it so much to call somebody ignorant or even yourself as ignorant. But it's just translated as wrong knowledge, right? You just have the wrong information. So the practices are really about just eliminating avidya, eliminating wrong information. And so we just want to come to see. And then it's in the seeing, then naturally comes from that, the doing. You know? The Sufis, I think, have a really nice way of holding this in the phrase of being in the world but not of the world. So living a completely normal life in the world, not having to be, you know, a hermit living in a cave with nothing, you know, making yourself uncomfortable as a way to avoid any pleasure, right? We can have that idea. But that's not really what the traditions are calling for, right? It's not about whether or not your clothes are comfortable or uncomfortable, or whether you have enough food or not enough food. It's the where is it coming from, right? Is it coming from the place of deficiency, from the ego's whole and seeking? Right? Then just notice that, see what you're up to. And if it's coming from the effulgence and the fullness of the self, see that and just ride the wave. You know, continue to unfold your fullness into the world. And if it's the emptiness, then notice that and see the untruth of that. You know, that's the invitation of the practice. More than a moral or ethic code that says this is right, that is wrong, which is what we tend to do of it, right? So we try to have a set of rules, tell me what to do, tell me what to eat, tell me how to behave, then I'll do that. What books are good, I'll read those. What books are bad, I won't read those, right? I mean, that's our tendency is to want it to be that way. But the conscious process is to come into contact with the truth of that in the moment, right? The discerning awareness, to know the truth as it's arising in the moment. So we're going to wrap up here. The last thing I'll say is what you might do as a follow-up exercise to the one we just did would be, if you're doing this with a partner, but you can do it with yourself, right, would be to tell me how it feels when you leave yourself. Right? Tell me how it feels when you leave yourself. So the other question was, tell me a way you leave yourself. This would be, tell me how it feels when you leave yourself. And that's to get in contact with that sense of what does it feel like when the sense driven by desire goes out and attaches to some object for whatever the motivation is. But it does that. What does that feel like? And again, it'll give you another layer of insight into the nature of that pattern, but it also becomes another motivation to practice. Because you'll probably realize that it's painful. It doesn't feel good. Right? But again, we want to find that out. Right? So Gary's going to pass the basket around. Yes? Absolutely. And I want to say